There are moments in geopolitics when the solution to a crisis is sitting right in front of the people responsible for solving it, and instead of reaching for it, they push it away. What you're about to hear is one of those moments. Iran is currently holding roughly 450 kilograms of enriched uranium material that could, in theory, be further refined to weapons-grade levels in a matter of weeks. The United States has one central demand: remove it. And right now, there appears to be exactly one proven, internationally verified pathway to do that. One mechanism capable of removing this material from Iran safely and permanently. And Washington has just closed the door on it. That decision, made quietly, without headlines, without detailed explanation, may turn out to be one of the most consequential strategic miscalculations of this entire crisis. And almost no one is explaining why. If you want to understand what's actually driving these decisions, not the headlines, not the political theater, but the real strategic mechanics, then subscribe. This channel breaks down the logic behind global events before the consequences become impossible to ignore. Now, to understand why this moment matters, start with a single number: 450 kilograms. That's the estimated size of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. And not just low-level enrichment, this is material enriched to around 60% purity. Weapons-grade uranium is typically around 90%. In other words, Iran is already much closer to that threshold than many people realize. The remaining technical gap is measured not in years, but potentially in weeks. That single fact has shaped every negotiation, every back-channel discussion, and every diplomatic maneuver surrounding this issue. And here's what often gets oversimplified. The United States doesn't have a long list of demands. It has one core requirement: remove the enriched uranium. Everything else, sanctions relief, diplomatic normalization, security arrangements, flows from that point. Every proposal eventually circles back to the same question: what happens to those 450 kilograms? That's the entire equation. And right now there is one major actor offering a concrete solution: Russia. Moscow's proposal is straightforward. Iran transfers the uranium out of the country. It is transported to Russia, stored under international supervision, and reprocessed into civilian nuclear fuel under monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency. On paper, this checks every box. The material leaves Iran. Iran retains its nuclear infrastructure. Verification is maintained. Escalation is avoided. So the obvious question is, if a solution exists that satisfies the core demand and reduces the risk of war, why reject it? According to reporting, including statements cited by Axios, the offer has not been accepted by the United States, and the reason is not the objective, it's the intermediary. Washington wants the uranium removed, but not into Russian hands. That distinction may seem minor. In reality, it's decisive. The concern is strategic. Russia's state nuclear company, Rosatom, already plays a major role in global nuclear fuel supply. Expanding that role would increase Moscow's leverage across international energy systems. From a U.S. perspective, that's a real geopolitical cost. But that calculation creates a contradiction. The United States wants the uranium gone. Iran is unlikely to hand it over directly to Washington or to its close allies. And the one mechanism that has worked before involves Russia. Which brings us to a critical historical point. This exact arrangement already existed under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under that agreement, Iran shipped out the vast majority of its enriched uranium, and Russia was the recipient. The process was monitored and verified by the IAEA over multiple years. It worked until the United States withdrew from the deal in 2018. So when Russian officials say they have proven experience handling this exact scenario, they are pointing to a documented precedent, not a theoretical plan. Which leads to the real question: if the mechanism exists and it has worked before, why is it now off the table? Iran's response suggests it understands the stakes. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi traveling to meet Vladimir Putin is not routine diplomacy, it's signaling a message without being stated outright. If the United States rejects the mechanism, Iran will continue engaging with the actor that can provide it, and Russia, for its part, has made clear the offer still stands. Which means the situation is no longer about whether a solution exists. It's about whether the parties involved are willing to accept who controls it. The Strait of Hormuz adds another dimension to this calculation that simply cannot be ignored. Iran's ability to restrict or complicate passage through that choke point gives Tehran leverage that extends far beyond its own borders. Every American ally dependent on Gulf energy flows has a stake in this. Any disruption to shipping through Hormuz sends ripples through global oil markets, drives up energy costs, and creates pressure on Washington from directions that have nothing to do with Iran directly. Iran understands this perfectly. By visibly engaging Russia while the uranium question remains unresolved, Tehran is making sure the cost of Washington's hesitation stays visible to everyone watching. Now add China to the equation, because what Beijing is not saying is just as important as what Moscow is saying publicly. Before Abbas Araghchi even boarded his flight to St. Petersburg, he held a call with Wang Yi. That conversation came before consultations with other regional players. The sequencing matters. It suggests China had early visibility into Iran's strategic thinking before the broader international community did. And yet Beijing has remained publicly silent. No statements on the St. Petersburg visit, no reaction to the uranium proposal, no visible positioning. But that silence is not absence, it's strategy. China's relationship with Iran's strategic programs is deep and well documented. Elements of Iran's defense and technological ecosystem have long depended on inputs from both Russia and China. And just days before the St. Petersburg meeting, China and Russia held discussions with the International Atomic Energy Agency focused specifically on Iran's nuclear program. That meeting on April 24th, followed by Araghchi's visit days later, is unlikely to be coincidental. It points to prior coordination and deliberate sequencing. What you're seeing is a layered process: the IAEA meeting as the coordination phase, the St. Petersburg visit as the execution phase, while China operates from a position of quiet strategic strength throughout. Beijing has already secured long-term energy arrangements with Iran, providing Tehran with economic breathing room. Despite sanctions pressure, it has the leverage to shape outcomes without stepping into the spotlight. China doesn't need headlines to influence results. Its role is quieter, but no less consequential. By sustaining Iran economically and coordinating at key moments with Russia and international institutions, China helps create the conditions for patience in Tehran, reducing urgency while gradually increasing pressure on Washington. Now, to address the counterargument, because it deserves to be taken seriously, the concern driving Washington's rejection is not fabricated. Vladimir Putin is not offering to take custody of Iran's uranium out of goodwill. This move would advance clear Russian interests. It would strengthen the global position of Rosatom, embed Russia as a central actor in any post-conflict regional framework, and give Moscow long-term influence over a highly sensitive strategic asset. These are real gains, and Washington's hesitation is rooted in coherent strategic logic, not paranoia. But here is the question that argument struggles to answer: not whether Russia benefits, because it clearly does, but whether the alternative produces a better outcome. Because the alternative is what we're seeing now: a conflict without resolution, a ceasefire that exists more on paper than in reality, rising tensions across critical maritime corridors, and oil prices elevated in ways that ripple through the global economy. And most importantly, roughly 450 kilograms of enriched uranium still inside Iran, unchanged, unresolved, and becoming more central to the crisis with each passing week. When you weigh those outcomes side by side, the cost of rejecting the Russian mechanism begins to look significantly heavier than the strategic benefit of denying Moscow additional influence. That is the calculation that was made, and the consequences of that calculation are now playing out in real time. So where does this go from here? Based on everything we've just walked through, the next phase of the story is already beginning to take shape. And importantly, what is happening now is no longer about abstract proposals or theoretical options. It is about engineering an actual operational framework that could, in practice, resolve the core technical issue at the center of the crisis. What is likely being discussed behind closed doors in St. Petersburg right now is not whether Russia takes custody of Iran's enriched uranium. That question in practical terms has already been answered in principle. The political direction has been signaled. The strategic alignment has been made visible. What remains is not the if, but the how. And that distinction matters because what is now being refined is the operational framework, precise timelines for the physical transfer of material, clearly defined transport conditions, secure storage arrangements under international supervision, and a structured technical pathway for reprocessing the uranium into civilian nuclear fuel. At the center of this structure sits the International Atomic Energy Agency, which would be responsible for verification, monitoring, and compliance enforcement across each stage of the process. In other words, the architecture being discussed is not informal or symbolic. It is intended to be procedural, auditable, and continuous. But there is one element in this framework that is far more politically sensitive than all the others combined: the question of what happens after Russia takes physical custody. Specifically, what limitations, if any, are placed on Russia's ability to use, reprocess, or commercially leverage that material. And this is where the real point of friction lies. From the American perspective, the concern is not only about removing uranium from Iran, it is also about the secondary strategic effects that could emerge if Rosatom gains additional leverage in global nuclear fuel markets through control of Iranian origin material. That includes fears that Russia could expand its influence over civilian nuclear supply chains, increase dependence among third countries on Russian enrichment services, or convert custody of this material into broader geopolitical bargaining power in the energy sector. In other words, the objection is not purely technical, it is structural. It is about long-term strategic positioning in a highly sensitive global industry. This is why the current discussions, if they are indeed progressing in the way indicated, are likely focused on one crucial design problem: how to construct binding constraints that are not only politically acceptable, but also technically enforceable. Because without enforceability, any limitation on Russian behavior becomes declarative rather than real. And without verification mechanisms strong enough to ensure compliance, the entire framework risks collapsing back into the same strategic uncertainty it was meant to resolve. This is also where the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency becomes more than just observational, it becomes structural. The agency would not only verify that uranium is transferred, but also that it is stored correctly, processed under agreed conditions, and not diverted into any non-civilian pathway. But even that raises a further question. Verification of physical movement is one thing. Verification of long-term economic and industrial usage inside another sovereign state is significantly more complex. And that complexity is precisely why this issue has not yet moved into a finalized agreement. So if the updated proposal emerging from these discussions in St. Petersburg includes genuinely binding, multi-layered constraints, technical, legal, and verifiable on what Russia can and cannot do with the material, then the central objection raised by Washington is at least partially addressed in substance, even if not fully eliminated in strategic terms. But if those constraints remain too vague, too political, or too difficult to enforce in practice, then the underlying deadlock remains intact, regardless of how elegant the diplomatic language around it may appear. Which brings us back to the core reality of this moment. The issue is no longer whether a solution exists. The issue is whether a solution can be constructed that satisfies three competing imperatives at once: Iran's sovereignty concerns, America's strategic objections, and Russia's expanding role in the global nuclear order. And that is why what is happening now is not just negotiation, it is system design under geopolitical pressure. From there, the process follows a fairly predictable diplomatic sequence. Abbas Araghchi carries the framework back to Tehran. It moves through internal review channels, consultations with political and security institutions, and then through a second layer of regional intermediaries who have quietly been involved throughout the process. Eventually, it returns to Washington's desk, and at that point, the decision becomes unavoidable: accept the mechanism as it has been structured, or reject it once again. If it is accepted, the implications are immediate and strategically significant. The uranium issue, what has effectively been the 99% of the deal, as former President Trump himself once described it, is resolved in practical terms. One of the central technical drivers of escalation is removed from the system. Pressure on key maritime corridors, including the broader Gulf energy architecture, begins to ease. Market uncertainty tied to escalation risk starts to decline. And, most importantly, the pathway toward de-escalation opens in a way that has not been available since the beginning of this crisis cycle. In that scenario, the conflict does not magically disappear, but it becomes structurally less combustible. However, if the proposal is rejected again, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate diplomatic impasse. At that point, the diplomatic record begins to consolidate into something more rigid, something that future actors in the system will not interpret neutrally, but politically. The narrative becomes increasingly defined by a simple sequence of observable facts. Iran demonstrated willingness to place limits on its enrichment pathway under external supervision. Russia presented a tested operational mechanism capable of physically removing the core material of concern from Iranian territory under international verification. And the United States declined the arrangement not once but repeatedly. In international politics, that kind of sequence does not remain abstract. It becomes part of the strategic memory of the system. It influences how alliances are evaluated, how credibility is assessed, and how future diplomatic proposals are interpreted, not only in this region, but across other contested theaters where similar mechanisms might be proposed. Because once a workable exit ramp is identified and rejected, the question shifts from technical feasibility to political intent. And that shift changes how other states read the situation entirely. In that sense, the solution to this crisis is not missing. It is not undeveloped. It is not waiting to be discovered through further negotiation. It already exists in a functional form, and in practical geopolitical terms, it is sitting on the table in St. Petersburg, embedded within a framework that has been tested before under the International Atomic Energy Agency verification system, and therefore not theoretical but precedent-based. Which is why the central question is no longer about engineering a solution. It is about political authorization. Who is willing to accept a solution that already works, and who is choosing not to? And at this stage, that question is becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. But there is an additional layer that complicates this even further, because Iran's behavior this week has not been limited to a single diplomatic channel or a single vector of engagement. It has been multi-layered, simultaneous, and deliberately sequenced across multiple external actors, each of whom occupies a different position in the emerging structure. And that is where the second dimension of this story begins, because while Washington is focused on the uranium mechanism itself, Tehran has been quietly shaping the broader strategic environment around it through energy leverage, maritime signaling, and coordination with both China and Russia in parallel tracks that reinforce each other rather than operate in isolation. This is not simply negotiation over a technical nuclear issue anymore. It is the construction of a parallel diplomatic architecture, one that connects energy flows, maritime choke points, sanctions resilience, and nuclear verification into a single interconnected bargaining system. And once you view it that way, the uranium proposal stops being an isolated solution. It becomes one node inside a much larger system of leverage, alignment, and strategic signaling that is still actively evolving in real time, which is why what happens next will not only determine the fate of this specific mechanism, but also shape how future crises of this kind are negotiated, because every major actor involved is now watching to see whether a tested solution, once placed on the table, is actually allowed to work. It moved on two tracks simultaneously through Pakistani intermediaries. Iran presented Washington with a separate proposal: reopen the Strait of Hormuz immediately, stabilize global energy markets, and provide the United States and its allies with a tangible, immediate de-escalation win. In this framework, the nuclear issue would be addressed on a separate diplomatic track later, once political conditions became more favorable and less charged. This was essentially a fast relief option: reduce immediate systemic pressure, demonstrate good faith, and create space for the more technically complex negotiations to follow. At the same time, Iran sent its foreign minister to St. Petersburg to reinforce the parallel structural proposal. The uranium pathway already exists, is operational in principle, and is based on a previously tested model under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency. In other words, two moves were made in the same week, one aimed at immediate de-escalation and one aimed at resolving the core technical issue over time. And according to this framing, neither was accepted. Instead, the response from Washington was to step back from engagement and reduce the diplomatic temperature, effectively pausing momentum rather than advancing either channel. From Tehran's perspective, this creates a highly unusual configuration. Two distinct exit ramps were offered into the system simultaneously, one designed to ease immediate pressure, the other designed to resolve the underlying structural risk, and yet neither has been taken. So when you look at the full picture, the structure becomes clearer. Russia is holding a technical custody-based solution in St. Petersburg. Pakistan is acting as a channel for alternative diplomatic proposals. China is sustaining Iran's broader economic resilience and shaping the strategic backdrop from a distance. And the United States is, at least for now, waiting for a different form of resolution to emerge, one that is not currently on the table. This is not simply a story of diplomatic complexity or competing narratives. It is a story about a set of decisions, specifically decisions about whether to accept or reject available mechanisms for de-escalation. And at the center of it remains one unresolved technical issue: roughly 450 kilograms of enriched uranium. Every additional day without agreement increases its political weight, deepens its strategic significance, and narrows the space for a clean resolution. When former President Trump described the uranium issue as 99% of the deal, he was pointing to a structural truth. This is the central node around which everything else revolves. And at this moment, the only tested mechanism capable of resolving that core issue is still sitting in St. Petersburg, verified in principle, operational in design, and historically validated under the IAEA framework. The solution was never missing. It was never unavailable. It was rejected.